Welcome to GS Podcast number 101. I'm Stephen Knight. I hope you're all well. Very pleased to have Dr. Melanie Joy on this episode. Melanie's a social psychologist from America. She's a vegan activist and an author. She popularised the term Carnism, which we'll speak at in great length, but she did this primarily in a wonderful book which I highly recommend called Carnism: Why We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs and Wear Cows. So I've been wanting to dedicate an episode of my show to the topic of meat consumption for some time. Been a little frustrated with how this topic doesn't get much coverage within so-called skeptical communities and free-thinking events and conferences. It seems like a topic that's ripe for awareness raising in that sense, and there's a lot of dogmas to be challenged in this area, a lot of misinformation, a lot of myths, a lot of sinister practices, and I've been wanting to have a conversation about it on the podcast, but I've been really wanting to have the right conversation, something that doesn't come across as preachy and judgmental. I think we'll leave that to the religious fundamentalist. So when I read Melanie's book, this was absolutely perfect because she talks about all the issues surrounding meat consumption, agriculture, the factory farming industry, but she speaks about it from an ideological perspective, and she's termed this Carnism, and I found this really quite compelling, and it's one of those things that seems quite obvious when it's laid out. So I'm hoping people who haven't really thought about this issue before will now leave this conversation knowing a bit more, and maybe that might encourage them to think about eating animals in a different light. I'm often hearing from people on Twitter, because they see a lot of my output on this topic, who have said, you know what, I've started reducing my meat consumption, I'm having meat-free Mondays, I'm swapping all meat and just eating fish until I can fully get on board with no animal products whatsoever. And then this is really encouraging, and this is really progressive, and I think this is the right sort of attitude to it. I understand it's difficult to drop habits of a lifetime straight away, but I think any progression in this area is good news. So feel free to let me know what you think about it. Let me know if this conversation's had any impact on the way you consider this issue, and whether or not it'll inform your eating habits going forward, and in what sense. Melanie's a lovely person. I would recommend seeking out her book. She's got a new book out as well called Beyond Beliefs, which is on my ever-increasing reading list. Don't think Melanie's either on Twitter, or if she is, I don't think she's particularly active. However, if you head over to www.carnism.org, you can find out some further information on there and how to reach out. And the organisation's on Twitter at Beyond Carnism. Please remember, the podcast is entirely listener supported. There's no adverts, there's no marketing, I'm not trying to sell you anything. So if you enjoy these conversations and would like to support the podcast, you can do so by visiting patreon.com/gspellchecker. And please remember to leave a review or rating on iTunes or Stitcher, and share the podcast on social media. Enjoy. There's a word that some folks find real hard to spell, ain't it? It's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Melanie Joy to the GS Podcast. Hello.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
It's my pleasure. It's great to speak to you. Really enjoyed your book, Carnism, Why We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs and Wear Cows, which I'm really looking forward to jumping into. But maybe you could tell my listeners a little bit about what you do before we talk about your book.
Yeah, so I am the founding president of the organization Beyond Carnism, which is in fact based on my book, Why We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs, and Wear Cows. And the mission of my organization, which is a charitable organization, is to expose and transform carnism globally. And we do this by using a couple of different methods, which I can explain later once we've actually talked about what carnism is.
Sure. Well, I think it'd be fair to say my main bulk of audience would be self-described skeptics, but I found this conversation about eating animals really difficult to have in that community, strangely. I don't think it's quite on their radar in a way you'd expect it to be for someone who's a self-described skeptic. And another thing I've noticed about it as well is whenever you try and bring up this topic of meat consumption, you often find that they defend the act of eating meat in similar ways to really dogmatic religious people hold on to their particular dogmas. And I mean, I've read quite a bit about vegetarianism, and they tend to touch the same ground, which is great. They talk a lot about the horrors of factory farming and the effects on the environment, but I'd never really seen somebody lay it down from an ideological perspective like your book does. And you've coined this term carnism to describe this, and maybe you could tell me a little bit about what that means.
Yeah, thank you. So carnism is the invisible belief system or ideology that conditions people to eat certain animals. It's essentially the opposite of veganism. We tend to assume that only vegans and vegetarians follow a belief system or an ideology. But the only reason that many of us learn to eat pigs but not dogs, for example, is because we do follow a belief system when it comes to eating animals. So when eating animals is not a necessity for survival, then it's a choice, and choices always stem from beliefs. It's simply that carnism is a dominant ideology, so it's invisible, and its tenets are like literally woven into the very structure of society. I wrote my doctoral dissertation on the psychology of eating meat, which was what led me to my conclusion that carnism is this dominant invisible ideology. And you mentioned earlier that people who, rational people don't respond to rational argumentation when it comes to an issue like this issue of eating animals. And that's because of the cognitive biases that are created by carnism that are, by definition, invisible. They're invisible biases that really prevent us from taking in the facts as facts and cause us to psychologically distort information that challenges carnism.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think my goal for this conversation as well would be to, cover the topics and dispel a few myths. But I suppose one of my main concerns is, how do you criticize something almost everybody does and accomplish that without sounding judgmental or preachy? How do you approach this conversation generally?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I have found and what I really believe is that this conversation needs to happen in a way that's not criticizing, but simply raising awareness. I grew up like many people eating animals, like most people eating animals. I also grew up with a dog who I cared about. I loved like a family member. I was always a person who I would consider compassionate, who, like most people, cared about animals and certainly wouldn't want them to suffer, especially when that suffering was so intensive and so completely unnecessary. I was also always a person who was very committed to social justice and rationality. And it wasn't until I was 23, actually, when I got sick from eating a hamburger. It was contaminated with Campylobacter, and I was hospitalized. And I stopped eating animals. I stopped eating meat, actually, because not for ethical reasons at the time, but because I was disgusted. When you have a horrible stomach issue, usually the last thing that you ate, you never want to eat again. Yeah. So and what happened was, I think it's because I was no longer invested in eating animals that I became receptive to the truth about eating animals, which I'll talk about in a minute. I was doing research and trying to learn about my new diet at the time, which was vegetarian. And of course, my research led me to discover information about animal agriculture. And what I learned really shocked and horrified me. This entire system was organized that was completely antithetical to my personal values of rationality and compassion and justice. It's organized in a way it's antithetical to most of our values. And but what shocked me perhaps even more was that nobody I talked to about what I learned was willing to hear what I had to say. They would respond like, don't tell me that, you'll ruin my meal, or, shut up, you crazy vegetarian hippie propagandist. And I, suddenly was like on the receiving end of this incredible defensiveness among people who were rational, caring people, just like I was and I had been when I was eating animals. So I became very curious about, what was going on psychologically. Why did the facts not sell the ideology? What was getting in the way? And that was what led me to discover Carnism. And what's, I think, most important to understand about Carnism is that it's an oppressive system or a violent system. It's literally organized around violence. Meat cannot be procured without killing, and egg and dairy production cause extensive harm to animals. And it really is antithetical to most people's values. So Carnism, systems such as Carnism, need to use a set of psychological defense mechanisms, which essentially distort our perceptions and numb our feelings so that we can act against our values and against our own interests and the interests of others without realizing what we're doing. And this is why, we find that very, rational people can use very irrational arguments to defend something that is in many ways, in many places in the world anyway, today indefensible.
Yeah, I mean, with you saying people don't want to hear these things, I can understand it given the cruelty that's involved. But I do find a lot of people generally have no idea what occurs in slaughterhouses. So I've used the word torture to describe that situation of a slaughterhouse. And people tend to think I'm referring to abuses rather than when things actually go to plan and run as they're supposed to. That's still an intense level of torture. And maybe you could speak a little bit about what the factory farming system is like for the animal and the slaughter process.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're absolutely right. And the primary defense of Carnism is denial, which is what you're essentially referring to. If we deny there's a problem in the first place, we don't have to do anything about it. And denial is expressed largely through invisibility. So not only is the ideology itself invisible, so eating animals is just simply seen as a given rather than a choice, but the victims are kept, conveniently out of sight and therefore out of public consciousness. So many people do not know. That said, thanks to the advent of the internet and the efforts of many advocates around the world, many people are informed. At least most people are aware of some of the most egregious practices of what happens in factory farms. And I had a student once in one of my classes who said, even if the violence within factory farms in general, I should say, were 80% less than intense than it actually is, that would be 20% too much for the average person. And so, I mean, these animals, if you think about it, I mean, it's just logical, when somebody is in fact a unit of production, then their welfare is secondary to the profits their body's going to turn. We know the way that humans who work in factories are treated. So you can imagine that the animals who are, exist in factories are not treated any better, and in many ways are treated much worse. So these, animals are often, they're supposed to be stunned before they're killed. The rate at which these individuals are supposed to be stunned is virtually impossible to ensure that they are in fact unconscious when they're sent to slaughter. Many of them end up shackled upside down. Their throats are slit. They're dipped in boiling water while fully conscious and alive. Obviously alive, but their lives are in some ways worse than even their deaths. I mean, they're born into intensive confinement. I mean, these individuals don't have a single good day in their life. They are born into factories where many of them will never see the light of day. They're crammed into, some of them are chickens, for example. Hens are crammed into crates with so many other birds. They can't open their wings. They can't even move around. Their beaks are cut off without any painkiller to prevent them from pecking each other to death. There is no way to produce meat, eggs, or dairy for the price that the average person is willing to pay, and to do it in a way that does not cause pretty intensive suffering to the individuals involved.
Yeah, I mean, it's a horror show when things run as planned, I think, which is what I try and stress to people as much as possible. But what sort of things does the industry do in general to stop people finding out this information, to having access to the conditions and evaluating it themselves?
It's different from country to country. And one thing that is sad but not surprising is that the industry doesn't have to work very hard to prevent people from finding out, because most consumers don't try to find out because they don't want to know. It's easier not to know. And it's not because they don't care. It's because they've been conditioned by the system to follow these paths, Carnism, to follow these paths of least resistance, which include don't ask, don't tell. There are obviously advocates and activists who are working very hard to bring this information out to the public, and who have been quite successful at doing so, such that the vegan movement is arguably one of the fastest growing social justice movements in the world today. So to keep those people out, there are various ways that this happens. In the United States, we have the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, which makes it illegal to engage in a number of activities, such as even photographing factory farms from a distance. So it is difficult for activists to get information to bring to the public, but it's not impossible. And for anybody who's, really curious and who really wants to know the truth, it's quite easy to get. The information is out there. There are great groups doing great work. Mercy for Animals, for example, in the U.S. They release footage of undercover slaughter on a fairly regular basis. And a number of groups are doing this work.
Okay. I mean, one of the things your book includes as well is actually first-hand accounts from people working the line in these factory farms. And there's some great concern really about the psychological welfare of the human beings who are engaged in this violence day in, day out, isn't there?
It's very difficult, if not impossible, to spend your life essentially in the killing fields in a death-saturated environment, slaughtering innocent individuals and not be psychologically impacted by that. The meat packing industry has been, criticized as being, Human Rights Watch said that it's one of the most violent industries in the world today. The industry violates basic human rights. Many people who work in meat packing plants and slaughterhouses are, immigrants, sometimes undocumented immigrants who can't advocate for their rights and who have to work in this highly dangerous death-saturated environment. So, this entire system, Carnism, is organized around an atrocity. It is a global atrocity that the vast majority of people would be deeply offended by and quite likely choose to withdraw their support from if they were truly aware of it. And not simply if they were aware of the consequences of animal agriculture, but also if they were aware of Carnism itself, this system that is structured to coerce us into behaving in ways that are ultimately against our own interests, the interests of animals, and the interests of the planet.
Yeah, when I tend to bring up these things, people often retort with, well, yeah, that's horrendous, but I, for instance, get my products from, free-range animals, or I go to my local family farm who aren't part of this, evil conglomerate factory farming system. What would you say to those people who get their animal products via them means?
Well, I think it's important to, I'd say a couple of points to that. I would say, first of all, it's impossible. The reason a key reason that I do the work that I do, which is raising awareness of carnism, is because I believe that it is impossible to have a truly objective conversation about eating animals as long as we are operating from within the very system that conditions us to believe that eating animals is legitimate in the first place. So, this idea of so-called humane, or as you say in the UK, organic meat, eggs, and dairy is a perfect example of how carnism distorts our perceptions when we step outside of the carnistic box, and we can see how irrational this whole notion is. For example, most of us would consider it cruel to slaughter a happy, healthy golden retriever simply because people like the way her legs taste. And yet, when the exact same thing is done to individuals of other species, we are expected to think of it as humane or as compassionate. So, so I think on one hand, it's important for us to really step outside of the carnistic box in order to really engage in these conversations. And I also think it's important to recognize that for many people, all of us, who are so deeply indoctrinated with the carnistic mentality, with carnistic ideology, change often comes slowly. And I think it's important to acknowledge that, changing one's mindset and one's behaviors is something that for many people takes time. And I really encourage people who are talking about veganism to really not frame the issue as, you're either vegan and you're part of the solution, or you're not vegan and you're part of the problem, but rather to invite people to become vegan allies, what I refer to as vegan allies. A vegan ally is a person who's not vegan themselves, not yet vegan themselves, but who really has been open to and learned about vegan ideology. So they support vegan ideology and support vegans. And so to really encourage people to move toward veganism, to be as vegan as possible, whatever that means to them. I think it's probably more productive for, to change the system by reducing one's consumption and ideally ultimately eliminating one's consumption of animals, than by simply switching the type of carnistic products a person is eating.
So I would imagine a number of my listeners haven't really entertained this conversation before, which is perfectly understandable. But I can also imagine a few things going through their heads, the typical anti-vegetarian myths that we hear. So I thought it might be useful just to dispel one or two of them. And I suppose the most pervasive one, which is possibly the most consequential, were it true, is that of nutrition. There seems to be still a pervasive notion that vegetarian or vegan diets are somehow deficient in the essential nutrients we need, such as protein, iron, B12, things like that. I mean, what would you have to say to that criticism?
Yeah, I think, again, it's important to, when people really recognize carnism as a dominant ideology, then it's easier to question the sort of traditional information that we've gotten from mainstream society. So, for example, I talk in my book about, one defense, which is justification, which is expressed through what I call the 3 ends of justification, a mythology about eating animals that's presented not as a mythology, a set of myths that are presented not as myths, but as somehow as objective facts. So the 3 ends of justification hold that eating animals is normal, natural, and necessary. And of course, these same arguments have been used to support other violent practices, from slavery to male dominance to heterosexual supremacy. What happens is that these carnistic defenses, this host of carnistic defenses, 2 of which I've spoken about tonight, become both internalized. We automatically basically learn to look at the world through the lens of carnism. So they become internalized, shaping our mentality as individuals. And they're also institutionalized, meaning that they're embraced and maintained by all major social institutions, from the family to the state. So, when we appreciate this, we can appreciate that there is a significant bias, carnistic bias that permeates all institutions in society. So when we study nutrition, for example, we're essentially studying carnistic nutrition. So we really need to be very, very critical when we think about, any kind of research that's coming out of a dominant ideology, particularly one that is invisible and organized to maintain itself through using defenses. We have to be very critical about that information. And, fortunately, more and more scientists, nutritional and medical researchers have stepped outside of the dominant carnistic paradigm enough to conduct research that doesn't have a carnistic bias. And in the United States, there's this entire plant-based movement. It is not an ideologically driven vegan movement. It's not about animal rights. It's about basically a health-driven movement. As more and more information has been, research has been produced that really is demonstrating the health benefits of a plant-based diet and the dangers of consuming a carnistic diet, more and more people are starting to adopt a plant-based diet. So I think, this idea of like the sickly vegan or the protein deficient vegan needs to really be thought about. There's a tremendous amount of literature basically debunking this argument as a myth. And it really needs to be looked at quite critically because it's emerged from a culture that is, invested in maintaining that people continue eating animals.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the issues or concerns I had when switching from vegetarianism to a predominantly vegan diet was the issue of B12, because that is quite an important nutrient, and that can only be obtained from animal products generally. I mean, obviously it can be synthetic. You can have fortified foods, such as I think like tofu and almond milk. I have a lot of almond milk, and you can take supplements as well. So I mean, what we're really saying is it is perfectly possible to have a fully nutritional, adequate diet on plant-based meals.
It's, not only possible, but there are more and more people who are, very leading cutting edge medical practitioners and nutritionists and individuals, like myself, who've been living on a plant-based diet for a long time now and got much, much healthier since going on it, who believe that it not only is it healthy, we know that it's healthy at this point, that it's well established that a vegan diet is healthy. The question is it the healthiest possible diet you can have? Or if somebody eats, for example, 2% of carnistic products, does that really impact their health negatively or not? But there's no question. And, when it comes to this question about protein, if you think about it, the strongest animals in the world, elephants and rhinos, for instance, are plant eaters. They're not they're not carnivores, they're herbivores. And so I think, it's for some people, it's not an option to eat a plant-based or a vegan diet. Some people are geographically or economically not able to make their food choices freely. But for many people, it is actually an option. And they can think about what my colleague Kathy Freston says, crowding out. If they want to move toward a healthier and a more compassionate diet, to really just add in more plant-based foods, which we know are so healthy and good for us, more beans, more whole grains, more, fruits and veggies. And then there's less room for the carnistic products.
Absolutely. So I suppose we'll hear often as well that, humans have always consumed meat. Our teeth are testament to that. I suppose that would fall under the natural, under your three N's, wouldn't it?
Yeah, we have to be very careful about what we call natural, often using the term, that something, often we use the argument that something is natural as a justification for continuing to engage in a behavior. And, how we define natural, again, is often how the dominant culture defines natural. We look at our history through the lens of the dominant culture. So we look at our so-called nutritional history, or the history of what we've chosen to eat through the lens of carnism. And, we only look as far back as we need to justify current carnistic practices. This is the way dominant ideologies operate. Our earliest ancestors, we know, were fruit eaters, with the occasional insect that had been stuck in a piece of fruit. So, but we don't look to our earliest ancestors to determine what's natural for us. We look to, their descendants who who were primates that had started eating animals. Never in the history of humankind, however, have we eaten the amount of animal products that we eat today. And frankly, we can also look at other practices such as infanticide or, murder and rape that are arguably as long-standing and therefore as natural as eating animals. But we would never use that as a justification for continuing those practices today.
It's similar to what I was saying when we started the conversation about skeptics responding like dogmatic religious people with throwing out naturalistic fallacies to some of these questions. You mentioned a point there about the rates at which we consume meat nowadays, and it seems like meat's more readily available, it's affordable, and other societies seem to be adopting a similar factory farming setup to America, and it just strikes me as like this can't possibly be sustainable forever in terms of the impact it has on the environment. So maybe there's something to be said there about the huge environmental cost of consuming animals.
Absolutely. I mean, animal agriculture is lose, lose, lose. It's the UN has stated that animal agriculture is one of the most serious, significant contributors to some of the most serious environmental problems facing the world today. No question about that. It's bad for the environment, it's bad for the animals, and it's bad for our health in many ways. And this is why, if I think people are much more open to this idea of moving towards veganism as being as vegan as possible. It is more realistic for people. And if everyone in the world were as vegan as possible, the world would be vegan quite quickly. More and more plant-based or vegan products are making it to grocery store shelves and restaurants. It is becoming, in many places in the world today, it's becoming easier and easier to eat a plant-based diet, and it's really becoming normalized.
Yeah, so what are some of the ways farming and agriculture impacts directly on the environment?
Oh, it's, deforestation, lands being, or trees being cut down in order to create grazing land for cattle. That's what deforestation is, creating infertile lands, fresh water depletion, greenhouse gas emissions from methane, from manure. There are a number of ways that animal agriculture is damaging the environment.
And how do you feel about the emergence or progression in the area of, I suppose, so-called synthetic meat or artificial meat? I'm not talking about like mock meat products, but companies like Memphis Meat, who seem to be getting a lot of backing from big entrepreneurs and businessmen, and they say they have created meat from animal cells, and they can use this to produce vast quantities of meat without the need for the farming conditions and the suffering. Is that something you feel like you would support?
It's a piece of a whole. There are a lot of different entrepreneurial initiatives that are seeking to create alternatives to animal agriculture, and so clean meat or lab-grown meat is one, and then we've got plant-based meats. Like, I don't know if you've heard of the Impossible Burger. So
is this the plant-based burger that bleeds?
It bleeds, yeah,
wow.
Exactly. So plant-based meats that are very realistic, and there are a number of those. This is another initiative. So, I think that anything that we are like really approaching, or one could argue that we are within an ecological crisis, and a large part of this crisis is animal agriculture. We are certainly in the midst of a global atrocity when it comes to animal suffering. So any initiative, any endeavor that reduces the harm that we're currently doing is something that I would support, as long as it's done, as long as it's ethical, more ethical than what's happening, which it clearly is. I mean, there are literally more animals slaughtered in 1 week globally than the total number of people killed in all wars throughout history. So, the extent of the suffering and the extent of the damage that we are doing on a minute-to-minute basis is, for most people, unimaginable. So I really do support and applaud efforts to stem the tide of destruction and ideally stop the tide of destruction.
Yeah, absolutely. I support it. I think it'd be great, because I hear from many meat eaters who can't even entertain the idea of giving up meat, but they would eat a meat alternative if it tastes the same. So maybe it's for them. I'm not sure I'm not just one of them things now where I'm not sure I could go back to the taste of meat. I think that it makes me feel quite nauseous just to smell it now. I don't know if you have a similar feeling towards it.
Yeah, I don't think in the future that we're going to be looking for like alternatives to carnistic products, because the thought of eating a dead body is going to be disgusting in and of itself. I mean, it's sort of like, why we don't make plant-based baby brains, for instance. Like, who would want a plant-based version of something that's actually disgusting to imagine consuming in the first place?
That's true. I never quite thought of it like that. And I suppose that's one of the problems, isn't it, about this carnism culture, that we don't necessarily apply the same rules of comparison to meat products as we would to just general carcasses. I mean, a lot of people say as well, for instance, if we just all accepted a vegan diet overnight, what's going to happen to all these farm full of animals? How are they just going to be left on their own? Are they just going to be abandoned? What would you say to that kind of question?
We're not all going to adopt a vegan diet overnight, so we don't need to worry about entertaining that conversation in the first place. I mean, it's like if everybody quit smoking from one day to the next, what would we do with all the tobacco fields? So it's a hypothetical, impossible situation that I find that there are some, and I understand how these questions are raised, but they actually detract from the real issue. And the real issue is, how do we make changes in our own lives and in our society so that we stop creating the level of suffering and damage and ecological devastation that is happening right now? Yeah,
I agree. These things, like you say, are complete red herrings. I found a very popular objection to the vegan diet, which I'm sure you'll probably know more of, but I've since seen is really not well supported. It's this idea that using the land for plant-based food production actually kills scores of animals and damages the land itself. And I was wondering if you've looked into that much.
I mean, industrialized agriculture harms animals, regardless as to, what you're producing. So if you're producing soybeans or you're producing corn, you're harming animals, especially if you're using pesticides. But simply in the production of those products, where, you've got animals, rodents, for example, in the grass, who are being harmed by the tractors and machines that they're using. So there is truth in that. Harming more animals than what we're actually doing when we, by farming land to to grow fruits and vegetables versus raising and slaughtering animals for their flesh and other body parts, doesn't make any sense to me, because the corn and soy and other vegetable products or plant products that we are growing are actually fed primarily to animals, who are then eaten by humans.
What can people do to get more active in this topic? Where can they go? What sort of things do they need to read, would you say?
Yeah, well, I think it would be, it's a good question. I think, being open to this, really recognizing, the existence of carnism and being willing to learn about carnism and the way it distorts perceptions, not simply of, meat, eggs, and dairy and animals, but also it distorts perceptions of vegans and veganism as a way to sort of shoot the messenger. If you shoot the messenger, you don't have to take seriously the implications of their message. This can go a long way. On our website, carnism.org, we have a lot of information about carnism. Obviously, my book has information about carnism. I have a new book that has just come out called Beyond Beliefs, a guide to improving relationships and communication for vegans, vegetarians, and meat eaters. And this is for people in inter-ideological relationships, which many people are actually in this day and age, because there are so many more vegans and vegetarians than there used to be. But it also covers, I actually talk about this issue. I have some chapters in there that can be shared with non-vegans as a way of helping them to be receptive to the information, to reduce defensiveness, and kind of lay out some of the rationale for why people become vegan in the first place. So the information is out there. Trying to think of another great book is Animal Liberation by Peter Singer, Utilitarian Philosopher. I think it would be great, and it's just so important that people like yourself, who are skeptical and who are rational and who are really trying to engage and encourage people to think more critically about a lot of different issues. If this community were really to be receptive to this carnism awareness, because it is a critical global problem. And I think it is something that deserves to be engaged with by people who are already working to help others think more critically and are committed to critical thinking themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we may have touched on this a little bit before, and we were talking about the progression in this area and how we're having more vegetarians and more vegans. And one of the things that seems to have arisen from that, unfortunately, is this idea of vegan purity, that it's veganism or nothing. And they can often be quite an antagonistic attitude towards vegetarians. And I'm sure you've noticed this yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I have noticed this myself. And, it's important to really be committed to a healthy process, regardless of what our ideology is, so the process is the how, the content is the what, so veganism is about compassion toward animals, social justice. You could look at, fill in the content with various words. The process is how we relate to that. So, you can relate to anything in a fundamentalist way. And it's, veganism notwithstanding, people can have a tendency, some people more than others have a tendency to start thinking and relating through the lens of fundamentalism. And the vegan movement is not immune to that kind of thinking.
Yeah, I mean, there seems to be this whole meme at the moment, and I think it's born out of the uncomfortable feeling you get from having your own behaviour and practices and habits challenged, and that's that vegans wear it on the sleeve and constantly want to talk it up at any opportunity. And I've actually found the opposite's true in most situations. I very rarely speak about my diet, but I'll often be asked, why am I not having the meat? Why am I not having the steak? Are you on a diet, kind of thing? And then when you announce you're a vegan or a vegetarian, you often get 20 questions and objections, and it becomes a group chat. I mean, what do you think that is? Is that some sort of reflection, do you think, for them?
Yeah, I write about this a lot in my book, Beyond Belief. So, I talked about carnistic defenses earlier, and what I didn't mention is that in my writing after Why We Love Dogs, I talked about another kind of defense. And so I look at two kinds of carnistic defenses, which I refer to as primary and secondary defenses. So primary defenses are the ones that we discussed this evening. They are designed to basically validate carnism, to teach us to believe that eating animals is the right thing to do. Secondary defenses are designed to invalidate veganism, and they do this by invalidating vegan ideology and the vegan movement as a whole. Oppressive systems, in my opinion, keep themselves alive by making sure that they're stronger than the counter system that challenges them. So in this case, carnism needs to stay stronger, be perceived as more valid than veganism is. And so, what ends up happening is, these defenses, secondary defenses, distort people's perceptions of vegans and of veganism. And, one defense, for example, is projection. We project onto vegans negative stereotypes, impossible expectations, a variety of distortions that set vegans up essentially for failure. It's like I said, it's a way of shooting the messenger. It's also a way of silencing vegans, and it is a way of discrediting the vegan message. So you're referring to, vegans who are tokenized, for example. You're expected to be the token vegan. And, many vegans feel like they can't get sick. They're held up to this impossible,
right. Yeah, sure.
This impossible ideal, right? And often it's an impossible moral ideal as well, where, as soon as a vegan has the sniffles, it becomes an excuse to discredit their entire ideology. The guy next door who just had quintuple bypass surgery was born with bad genetics, right? So, Another example is, and this has been used to, this stereotype has been used to discredit and silence proponents of social justice movements throughout history. So it's framing the advocate or the activist as overly emotional. So vegans are often perceived as just, sentimental animal lovers who are overly emotional. And really, if you think about this, first of all, the same thing was said about slavery abolitionists in the United States and about feminists, about the suffragists. So when somebody is overly emotional or too emotional, by definition, they're not rational, and a person who's not rational isn't worth listening to. And when you can see how irrational this stereotype is when you recognize that vegans' response of sadness and grief and anger at the plight of the animals, the atrocity that is carnism, is in fact a healthy, legitimate response to what's happening in the world. Much more concerning from a psychological perspective is the numbing and apathy that pervades the dominant culture. So, many people in the West, for example, would have the same emotional reaction if they discovered that the meat, eggs, and dairy that they had been eating all their lives, that they'd been served, actually came from dogs and cats, and had witnessed, graphic videos and imagery of the torture of these animals. And then when they, tried to share the information they learned, the people around them thought that they were crazy, hysterical, overly emotional, biased, et cetera, et cetera.
So I don't know how much this plays on in terms of the political landscape in the States, but in the UK there's a huge debate often raging, and there's a lot of interest in this idea of halal slaughter and kosher meat, and I find it difficult to jump on that bandwagon given I consider any form of slaughter to be unacceptable and not at all preferable. So I was wondering if you have an opinion on this idea of the religious slaughter. Is there a huge argument for it being worse than the norm, or is there not much in that, would you say?
To my knowledge, it's not hugely. We're basically comparing forms of torture.
Yes,
so I don't even know how useful it is to decide which form of torture is more torturous. Most people would be opposed to any torture. There are people in the Middle East, there are groups in the Middle East working to raise awareness of halal slaughter and problems associated with that. There are, groups in Israel working to raise awareness of kosher slaughter, which is supposed to be more humane, but which is often not more humane. So these issues are being addressed by people who are in a better position to speak about them from within the communities that they're happening in. But I just think it's important to recognize that even if one form of torture is worse than another, it doesn't change the fact that they're both forms of torture.
I think certainly from a UK perspective, the kosher meat's generally considered worse because I think that's the process where there's no stunning whatsoever involved. I think a good 90% of the halal meat in the UK is stunned. I think there's a very small orthodox sect of Islam that doesn't stun the meat, but like you say, it is different forms of torture. And I suppose once you've already took a step back and you can see the bigger picture, it seems very strange to take objection to that one particular thing and be outraged by that one particular instance, and then continue to enjoy your burgers and your steaks from the normal methods. I've really enjoyed speaking to you, Melanie. I've pretty much whizzed through most of the questions that I wanted to ask. Is there anything at all that you want to get across at all before I let you get back to your day? Yeah,
thank you. You've really you've covered it quite well, actually, and I've appreciated the questions you've raised, and it's been really great talking to you, and I'm glad. I appreciate that you're helping to raise awareness of this important issue.
Well, thank you. Likewise, I've really wanted to dedicate an episode of my podcast this topic for the longest time. I've never quite figured out how to do it, and then as soon as I read your book and how you really tapped into the ideological component of this thing in detail and laid it out there, it just really resonated to me, and I think it'll definitely have an effect on my listeners as well. So thank you for the excellent work that you do.
Oh, great. And thank you as well. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the Godless Spellchecker podcast. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please consider supporting by visiting gspellchecker.com/support. From here, you can either become a Patreon subscriber, or you can give a one-off donation through PayPal, or you can just follow some instructions on how best to share the podcast on social media. Put it on a memory stick, throw it at people, whatever works best. Any support's greatly appreciated. I think we've all learned something here today.